There is a contradiction unfolding across America that few people fully understand. Baby boomers are often described as the wealthiest generation in modern history. They came of age during one of the greatest economic expansions ever recorded, watched home values rise for decades, and benefited from opportunities that younger generations often believe no longer exist. Yet as millions of them reach retirement age, an uncomfortable reality is emerging beneath the surface. More and more older Americans are continuing to work long after they expected to retire. Some are driving for ride-sharing companies, others are taking part-time retail jobs, and many are searching for any source of supplemental income simply to keep up with rising living expenses. Even retirees who own their homes outright are struggling with property taxes, insurance premiums, utility bills, and healthcare costs that continue to climb year after year. What was once supposed to be a season of financial security is increasingly becoming a period of economic uncertainty. For years, the popular explanation was simple. Many people assumed that retirees who found themselves in financial trouble must have failed to save enough money or made poor decisions along the way. But when we step back and examine the broader economic picture, the story becomes far more complicated. What appears to be a collection of individual mistakes begins to look more like the gradual breakdown of an entire retirement system that millions of Americans were taught to trust. The truth is that retirement itself is a relatively new invention. For most of human history, people worked until they physically could not continue. Families, churches, and local communities provided support during old age, and the idea of completely stepping away from work while continuing to receive a stable income was little more than a fantasy. It was only during the 20th century that governments, corporations, and financial institutions came together to create what many believe would become a permanent retirement model. For a time, that model appeared unstoppable. Social Security provided a safety net, pension plans promised guaranteed income for life, rising wages, affordable housing, and economic growth reinforced the belief that every generation would retire more comfortably than the one before it. Millions of Americans built their lives around that promise, convinced that decades of hard work would eventually lead to financial stability and peace of mind. But today, the foundations of that promise are beginning to crack. Traditional pensions have largely disappeared. Social Security is facing growing financial pressure. Healthcare costs are consuming larger portions of retirement income. Inflation continues to erode purchasing power, while housing-related expenses remain stubbornly high. And for millions of baby boomers, the retirement they spent decades preparing for is looking very different from the one they were promised. The most troubling part is that this may not be the end of the story. What is happening to baby boomers could be the first visible warning sign of a much larger economic transformation. Because if the retirement system that supported the largest generation in American history is starting to fail, the question is no longer why boomers are retiring broke. The real question is whether retirement itself is quietly becoming an endangered concept in the modern economy. To understand why so many baby boomers are reaching retirement with far less financial security than expected, we need to go back to a time before retirement even existed. For most of human history, people simply worked for as long as their bodies allowed. Farmers worked their land into old age. Craftsmen continued their trades until illness or physical decline forced them to stop. There was no pension check arriving every month, and no expectation that life after work would be financially supported by an institution. That began to change during the Great Depression. As millions of Americans struggled through economic hardship, political leaders faced a growing question about how to support older citizens who could no longer work. The answer arrived when the Social Security system was established, creating something revolutionary for its time. For the first time in history, ordinary workers could spend decades contributing to a national system and later receive income after leaving the workforce. The decades that followed created what many economists now describe as the golden age of retirement. America emerged from the Second World War as the world's dominant economic power. Manufacturing boomed, wages rose steadily, and unions helped secure benefits that had rarely existed before. Millions of workers entered careers that offered not only stable paychecks, but also employer-funded pensions that promised guaranteed income for life. For the parents of the baby boomers, the formula seemed almost foolproof. Work for one company, contribute to Social Security, collect a pension, pay off your home, and enjoy a comfortable retirement. The system appeared so successful that many families assumed it would continue indefinitely. It became embedded in American culture, shaping expectations about work, savings, home ownership, and old age. Baby boomers grew up watching this model succeed. They watched parents and neighbors retire with confidence. They saw older generations receive monthly pension checks and Social Security benefits that provided genuine financial stability. As a result, many assumed that the same system would be waiting for them when their turn finally arrived. What most people failed to notice was that the foundation beneath that retirement model was already beginning to shift. Long before the first boomers approached retirement age, the economics supporting pensions were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Companies were discovering that guaranteeing lifetime income to retirees was far more expensive than expected, especially as Americans began living longer and healthcare costs started rising. The promises made during the golden years were becoming harder to finance with each passing decade. At the same time, a demographic change was quietly unfolding across the country. The ratio between active workers and retirees was beginning to shrink. Social Security had been designed during an era when large numbers of workers supported a relatively small retired population. But as life expectancy increased and birth rates gradually declined, the math that once appeared stable started moving in a dangerous direction. Yet almost nobody was paying attention. Politicians continued promising benefits. Employers continued offering retirement plans. Financial institutions continued selling the dream of a secure future. From the outside, everything looked normal. But beneath the surface, the system was accumulating pressures that would eventually reshape retirement for an entire generation. And then, during the late 1970s, a little-known change buried deep inside the American tax code quietly set in motion one of the most consequential financial transformations in modern history. Few people noticed it at the time. Fewer still understood what it would eventually do, but that single change would transfer retirement risk away from corporations and place it directly onto the shoulders of millions of ordinary workers, permanently altering the future of retirement in America. The turning point arrived so quietly that most Americans never realized it was happening. There was no national announcement declaring the end of the traditional retirement system. There was no warning that the responsibility for retirement security was about to shift from corporations to individual workers. Instead, the transformation happened gradually, hidden inside boardrooms, financial regulations, and tax policies that few ordinary people ever paid attention to. For decades, pensions had been the backbone of retirement in America. Under the pension model, employers carried most of the responsibility and risk. Workers spent years, sometimes entire careers, with a company and were promised a predictable stream of income after retirement. The burden of managing investments, forecasting future liabilities, and ensuring retirees receive payments remained largely in the hands of corporations. But by the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, cracks were beginning to appear. Americans were living longer than previous generations. Healthcare costs were rising. Companies faced growing obligations to support retirees for decades after they left the workforce. What once looked manageable during periods of rapid economic expansion was becoming increasingly expensive in a slower and more competitive global economy. The warning signs became impossible to ignore when major pension failures started making headlines. One of the most famous examples involved the collapse of Studebaker, where thousands of workers discovered that promised retirement benefits were far less secure than they believed. Events like this exposed a disturbing reality. A pension was only as strong as the company standing behind it. If the company failed, the retirement dreams of entire workforces could collapse alongside it. Corporate America began searching for alternatives. Businesses wanted a retirement system that reduced long-term liabilities and protected balance sheets from unpredictable future costs. Eventually, they found exactly what they were looking for. A relatively obscure provision in the tax code opened the door to a new type of retirement account that would eventually become known as the 401k. At first, few people understood the significance of this change. The new accounts were originally designed for limited purposes and were not intended to replace traditional pensions. But employers quickly recognized an enormous advantage. Under the 401k model, the responsibility for retirement savings shifted away from the company and onto the worker. Instead of guaranteeing retirement income, employers would simply provide access to an investment account and, in some cases, offer matching contributions. The difference may have seemed small at the time, but economically it was revolutionary. Under the old system, corporations absorbed investment risk. Under the new system, workers absorbed investment risk. Under the old system, companies worried about market crashes. Under the new system, retirees worried about market crashes. One simple structural change transferred trillions of dollars in long-term responsibility from institutions to individuals. This new model was marketed as empowerment. Workers were told they now had greater control over their financial futures. They could choose investments, determine contribution levels, and build wealth according to their own goals. On the surface, that sounded like freedom. In reality, it also meant millions of people were suddenly expected to become investment managers, risk analysts, tax planners, and retirement strategists without any formal training. For many baby boomers, the timing could hardly have been worse. They entered a financial world where retirement security increasingly depended on stock market performance. Yet many had already lived through years of inflation, stagnant markets, and economic uncertainty that made investing seem dangerous. Some avoided the market altogether, others participated inconsistently. Many simply assumed they had more time than they actually did. The consequences became visible over the following decades. Retirement outcomes no longer depended primarily on years of service or employer commitments. Instead, they depended on market cycles, contribution rates, withdrawal decisions, fees, inflation, and luck. Two workers with similar careers could arrive at retirement with dramatically different outcomes, simply because one experienced a major market downturn at the wrong time or failed to invest consistently. What emerged was something economists rarely discuss openly. America had not merely changed its retirement system, it had transformed retirement into a financial experiment. Millions of households were now dependent on asset prices continuing to rise, markets remaining stable, and future economic conditions cooperating with carefully constructed retirement projections. The entire system increasingly relied on assumptions that nobody could guarantee. And just as baby boomers were learning to navigate this new world, another problem was quietly forming beneath the surface. It was a force far larger than pension failures, stock market volatility, or individual investment mistakes. It was a structural shift powerful enough to erode savings, distort retirement plans, and weaken purchasing power across multiple generations. That force was inflation, and its long-term impact would prove far more destructive than most Americans ever imagined. For many Americans, retirement planning has always been built around a simple assumption: save consistently, invest wisely, pay off your home, and eventually your expenses will become manageable enough to live comfortably on retirement income. On paper, the formula appears logical. In reality, one force has repeatedly disrupted those calculations and undermined even the most carefully constructed retirement plans. That force is inflation. Inflation is often discussed as a temporary inconvenience or a short-term economic problem. Politicians debate it, central banks attempt to manage it, financial markets react to it. But for retirees, inflation represents something far more dangerous. It is a silent and continuous reduction in purchasing power that compounds year after year. Unlike market crashes, which are dramatic and visible, inflation works slowly, gradually eroding financial security until people realize their money no longer buys the life they expected. Many baby boomers entered adulthood during one of the most turbulent inflationary periods in modern American history. During the 1970s, prices rose rapidly across large portions of the economy. Energy costs surged, consumer goods became more expensive, housing affordability deteriorated. Families discovered that income growth often failed to keep pace with the rising cost of living. The experience left a lasting impression on an entire generation and created widespread distrust toward economic stability. Although inflation eventually moderated, the underlying problem never truly disappeared. Over the following decades, Americans became accustomed to measuring wealth through asset appreciation. Homes increased in value, stock portfolios expanded, retirement account balances grew. On the surface, many households appeared wealthier than ever before. Yet beneath those gains, the actual cost of maintaining a middle-class lifestyle continued rising steadily. Healthcare became one of the most powerful examples of this phenomenon. Medical expenses increased far faster than many retirees anticipated. Insurance premiums climbed. Out-of-pocket costs expanded. Prescription medications became increasingly expensive. For older Americans living on fixed incomes, healthcare transformed from a manageable expense into one of the largest threats to long-term financial stability. A single serious illness could rapidly consume years of savings that had taken decades to accumulate. Housing created another unexpected challenge. For generations, Americans were taught that paying off a home represented the final step toward financial freedom. The assumption was straightforward. Once the mortgage disappeared, housing costs would become minimal. But many retirees discovered that ownership itself remained expensive. Property taxes continued rising. Insurance premiums increased. Maintenance costs grew larger as homes aged. Even households that technically owned their properties outright often faced thousands of dollars in recurring annual expenses. Food and energy costs added further pressure. Unlike discretionary spending, these are necessities that cannot easily be eliminated from a household budget. Retirees can postpone vacations, reduce entertainment spending, or delay major purchases. They cannot stop eating, heating their homes, or paying utility bills. As these essential categories absorbed larger shares of monthly income, retirement budgets became increasingly strained. At the same time, Social Security benefits struggled to fully compensate for the rising cost of living. While annual adjustments attempted to keep pace with inflation, many retirees felt that the increases failed to reflect the actual expenses they faced. The categories consuming the largest portions of retirement budgets often rose faster than official measures suggested. As a result, many older Americans experienced a growing gap between reported inflation and their personal financial reality. This created what could be called a retirement cost shock. Individuals who believed they had saved enough suddenly discovered that their projections no longer matched reality. Financial plans built decades earlier were based on assumptions that no longer applied. The amount of money required to maintain a comfortable lifestyle continued moving higher, while retirement income sources struggled to keep up. What looked adequate on paper often proved insufficient in practice. For some retirees, the solution was returning to work. For others, it meant reducing spending, downsizing, delaying medical treatments, or relying more heavily on family support. But these individual adjustments reveal a much larger issue. The problem was no longer limited to investment decisions or retirement account balances. It had evolved into a systemic affordability crisis affecting nearly every major category of household spending. And yet inflation alone does not fully explain why so many boomers are struggling. Because even as living costs surged, another powerful transformation was reshaping the economic landscape. Globalization, wage stagnation, and the gradual hollowing out of middle-class earning power were quietly reducing the ability of millions of Americans to build wealth in the first place. By the time many workers realized what was happening, the foundation of the American retirement dream had already begun to erode from both sides at once. At first glance, the retirement struggles facing millions of Americans appear to be a uniquely domestic problem. Rising healthcare costs, Social Security concerns, disappearing pensions, and housing affordability are often discussed as issues specific to the United States. But when economists examine the data across developed nations, a different picture emerges. The same pressures affecting American retirees are appearing across much of the industrialized world, suggesting that something much larger is taking place. One of the most important forces behind this shift is demographics. For decades, retirement systems were built around a simple assumption. Large numbers of younger workers would continuously enter the labor force and support a relatively smaller retired population. That model worked well when birth rates were high and populations were expanding rapidly. Today, however, many developed countries are experiencing the opposite trend. Across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, populations are aging. While birth rates continue to decline, fewer workers are entering the labor market, while larger numbers of people are leaving it. This creates enormous pressure on public retirement systems that depend on active workers funding benefits for current retirees. As the ratio between workers and retirees shrinks, governments face increasingly difficult choices involving taxes, benefits, debt, and public spending. Japan provides one of the clearest examples of this challenge. For years, the country has struggled with a rapidly aging population and low birth rates. The result has been slower economic growth, mounting fiscal pressures, and a constant effort to balance the needs of retirees with the realities of a shrinking workforce. Similar concerns are now emerging across Germany, Italy, South Korea, Canada, and numerous other developed economies. The retirement crisis is becoming a global phenomenon rather than an isolated national problem. At the same time, globalization transformed the economic environment that once supported middle-class prosperity. Throughout much of the post-war era, American manufacturing provided stable jobs, strong wages, and predictable career paths. These positions often came with benefits that helped workers accumulate wealth and prepare for retirement. But as companies increasingly shifted production overseas in search of lower costs, many communities experienced a gradual erosion of those opportunities. The effects extended far beyond factory closures. Global competition placed downward pressure on wages across numerous industries. Workers found themselves competing not only with their neighbors, but also with labor markets around the world. While productivity continued to rise and corporate profits expanded, wage growth for many households struggled to keep pace with the increasing cost of living. This created a growing disconnect between economic output and individual financial security. For baby boomers, the timing was especially significant. Many spent decades believing that economic growth alone would ensure a comfortable retirement. Instead, they experienced an environment where wages often failed to keep pace with housing, healthcare, education, and other major expenses. The result was a gradual weakening of the wealth-building mechanisms that previous generations had relied upon. Even workers who remained employed often found it increasingly difficult to save meaningful amounts for the future. Meanwhile, governments around the world responded to economic slowdowns, financial crises, and demographic pressures by accumulating unprecedented levels of debt. Borrowing became a tool for supporting growth, funding social programs, and stabilizing economies during periods of stress. While these policies often provided short-term relief, they also created long-term obligations that future taxpayers would eventually have to support. Retirement systems became increasingly intertwined with broader fiscal challenges. This is where the retirement crisis begins to evolve into something far larger than personal finance. It becomes a question of national balance sheets, demographic, sustainability, and institutional trust. When citizens spend decades contributing to retirement programs, they assume those programs will remain viable when they are needed. If confidence in that promise begins to weaken, the consequences extend beyond economics. They affect public trust in governments, financial institutions, and the social contract itself. Many economists refer to this type of environment as a trust recession. Unlike a traditional recession, which is measured through employment and economic output, a trust recession emerges when people gradually lose confidence in the systems they depend upon. Individuals save more aggressively, spend less freely, delay major life decisions, and become increasingly skeptical of long-term promises. The effects can ripple throughout an economy for years, creating self-reinforcing cycles of uncertainty. And this may be the most important lesson hidden inside the retirement struggles of the baby boom generation. The crisis is not simply about whether retirees have enough money. It is about whether the institutions that once guaranteed financial security can continue operating under 21st century realities. Because if demographic pressures, rising debt, and affordability challenges continue on their current trajectory, the next generation may face a question even more unsettling than retirement itself. What happens when an economy reaches a point where millions of people can no longer afford to stop working, yet younger generations cannot afford to fully begin building wealth either? That question leads directly to the final chapter of this story, where the future of retirement, work, and financial independence may look radically different from anything previous generations ever imagined. For more than half a century, retirement has been presented as the final reward for a lifetime of work. The formula appeared straightforward: study hard, find stable employment, save consistently, purchase a home, contribute to retirement accounts, and eventually reach a point where work becomes optional. Entire industries, financial products, and government programs were built around this assumption. Yet, as the experiences of millions of baby boomers demonstrate, that model is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The reality is that traditional retirement was largely a product of a unique period in economic history. It emerged during an era characterized by strong population growth, expanding industrial output, rising wages, affordable housing, and favorable demographics. Governments collected taxes from growing workforces. Companies generated enough profits to support pension obligations. Households benefited from decades of asset appreciation. For a time, the system functioned remarkably well. But the economic conditions that made that model possible are changing. Populations are aging, debt burdens continue rising, healthcare costs consume larger portions of household income, housing affordability remains under pressure, public retirement systems face increasing financial strain. At the same time, technological disruption is reshaping labor markets at a pace rarely seen before. The environment that supported traditional retirement is no longer as stable as it once appeared. This does not necessarily mean retirement will disappear entirely. Wealthy households will likely continue retiring comfortably. Individuals who accumulate substantial assets may still achieve complete financial independence. What is changing is the expectation that retirement will automatically occur for the average worker simply by following the traditional path. Increasingly, financial security in later life will depend on adaptability rather than assumptions inherited from previous generations. A new model is already beginning to emerge. Instead of viewing retirement as a complete separation from work, many people are transitioning toward a hybrid approach. Some continue consulting within their industries. Others develop online businesses, freelance careers, remote positions, or part-time professional roles. Rather than stopping work altogether, they reduce intensity while maintaining income streams. In many cases, the goal is no longer to avoid work entirely, but to gain greater control over how and when work is performed. This shift is transforming the meaning of financial independence itself. Previous generations often viewed retirement as the absence of employment. The emerging model focuses more on flexibility, resilience, and optionality. Individuals seek the ability to choose their work rather than being forced into it by necessity. That distinction may become one of the defining economic themes of the coming decades. Perhaps the most valuable retirement asset of the future will not be a pension, a stock portfolio, or even a fully paid off home. It may be the ability to continue generating value regardless of age, skills that remain relevant, knowledge that can be monetized, and the capacity to adapt to changing economic conditions may prove more important than any single financial product. In a world defined by uncertainty, human capital becomes a form of insurance. This is especially important for younger generations observing the struggles of many boomers today. The lesson is not that saving and investing are pointless. The lesson is that relying on a single system, a single institution, or a single source of retirement income carries significant risk. Diversification applies not only to investments but also to income sources, skills, and long-term financial planning. The future may belong to those who build multiple layers of resilience rather than depending on a single promise. What makes this moment historically significant is that America may be witnessing the end of one retirement era and the beginning of another. The transition is uncomfortable because it challenges assumptions that have existed for decades. Millions of people plan their lives around expectations that are no longer guaranteed. Yet every major economic transformation creates both risks and opportunities for those willing to adapt. The story of the baby boom generation is therefore larger than retirement alone. It is a warning about demographic change, institutional fragility, inflation, debt, and the limits of economic promises. But it is also a reminder that financial outcomes are rarely determined by a single event. They are shaped by long-term trends, structural forces, and decisions made over decades. Understanding those forces may be one of the most important advantages anyone can have in the years ahead. Because the real reason so many boomers are retiring broke is not simply that they failed to prepare, it is that they entered retirement during the collision of multiple economic transformations occurring at the same time. And as those transformations continue unfolding, the question facing younger generations is no longer whether they can retire the way their parents expected. The question is whether they can build a new definition of financial security before the old one disappears completely. When many people look at the baby boom generation, they see rising home values, decades of economic growth, and the accumulation of enormous amounts of wealth. From a distance, it appears as though this generation won the economic lottery. But the deeper we examine the data, the more complicated the story becomes. Behind the headlines about record household wealth stands a very different reality, one in which millions of older Americans are entering retirement with far less security than they expected. The common narrative suggests that retirement struggles are simply the result of poor personal decisions. Some people failed to save enough, others spent too much. Some invested poorly or delayed planning for the future. While those factors certainly matter, they do not explain the scale of the problem. What happened to many baby boomers was not the result of a single mistake. It was the result of multiple structural forces colliding over several decades. They witnessed the disappearance of traditional pensions. They experienced periods of inflation that weakened purchasing power. They endured stock market crashes that destroyed years of accumulated savings. They faced healthcare costs that rose faster than expected. They lived through globalization, wage stagnation, financial crises, and an economic system that increasingly transferred risk from institutions to individuals. By the time many reached retirement age, the world they had planned for no longer existed. Perhaps the most important lesson is that retirement is not guaranteed by age alone. For much of modern history, Americans were encouraged to believe that retirement was the natural destination at the end of a successful career. But history suggests otherwise. Retirement as we know it was created by a unique combination of economic conditions that may never fully return. The assumptions that supported previous generations are now being tested by demographic realities, fiscal pressures, and rising living costs. That does not mean the future is hopeless. In fact, one of the most powerful takeaways from this story is that awareness creates opportunity. Younger generations have access to information, tools, and financial education that were unavailable to many of the people who came before them. They can learn from previous mistakes, diversify their income sources, invest earlier, manage risk more effectively, and prepare for a future that may look very different from the past. The challenge is that preparation now requires a different mindset. Financial security can no longer depend entirely on a pension, a government program, or a single employer. It increasingly depends on adaptability, lifelong learning, multiple streams of income, and the ability to respond to economic change. The rules of retirement are evolving, whether society is ready for that reality or not. And that brings us to the question at the center of this entire discussion. If the largest and arguably most prosperous generation in American history is struggling to retire comfortably, what does that mean for the generations following behind them? If rising debt, demographic decline, inflation, and affordability pressures continue along their current path, are we witnessing a temporary challenge, or are we witnessing the slow transformation of retirement itself? The answer to that question may shape the financial future of millions of people over the coming decades. Because the story of the baby boomers is not just about the past. It may be offering a glimpse into the future. If you enjoyed this fact-based analysis of economics, retirement systems, demographic trends, and the forces shaping the future of financial security, be sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe retirement will remain achievable for future generations, or are we entering a world where working later in life becomes the new normal? The conversation is only beginning.